Mark Carney's a rich man. Welcome back to Moose and Loose. My name's David. Today, and it seems every day going forward here, he's becoming more rich. That's right. His stock value in Brookfield continues to go up. He continues to announce projects that could drastically inflate Brookfield's stock price, such as in this episode, we've got David Cochran interviewing him, and he mentions once again modular houses, carbon credits, but is Donald Trump going to get in the way of this? You see, Trump has come out with a tweet once again mentioning the 51st state, trolling Carney again. What's going to happen? Let's jump into this. Moving along here, we've got this one. Says Carney says more movement on tariffs needed before CUSMA talks start. Prime Minister thanks Trump beginning to get the hint about Canadian sovereignty. This whole throne speech just a ploy to convince Donald Trump that we're a sovereign nation. We're not the 51st state. Donald Trump doesn't care about the throne speech or the king or King Charles or the monarchy or any of that stuff. He doesn't. Prime Minister Mark Carney says more progress needs to be made on resolving the tariff issue with the United States before renegotiating the CUSMA agreement. In response to King Charles' throne speech, we have Donald Trump saying, I told Canada, which very much wants to be a part of our fabulous Golden Dome system, that it'll cost $61 billion if they remain a separate but unequal nation, but will cost $0 if they become our cherished 51st state. They are considering the offer. Now, is he just outright lying? Is he trolling? Did Mark Carney make a secret deal we don't know about? Who knows? Most likely he's just trolling once again, but who knows between these guys? We don't know what's going on. And we've got the bloc leader, Blanchette, says he pointed out there's no mention of Donald Trump during the throne speech.
Because the issue at the beginning of the campaign was the threat from Donald Trump. And in the speech, there's no such thing. It just vanished. Disappeared.
Just vanished, yep. No mention of Trump. There was a few indirect shots at Trump in that throne speech, though. And we got Vasi Kapels commenting on the situation with the king and Donald Trump.
That statement went on to say that there are ongoing conversations about strengthening NORAD and also the Golden Dome, but did not mention any numbers. What does that back and forth tell us about the future of the Canada-U.S. relationship, and how much of a difference will the king's visit actually make long-term?
I'll answer that question, Omar, in the words of someone who used to lead the Canada-U.S. file for the previous government, who texted me tonight, good luck, guys, kind of implying this is incredibly unpredictable, basically. And though we saw this show of solidarity around sovereignty today in a very unique and historical fashion, ultimately, Donald Trump is going to Donald Trump, and that will inform the relationship between our two countries for at least the next 3 or more years.
We saw Donald Trump's response there, coming out with the Golden Dome stuff, saying that we're already thinking about taking the offer 51st state.
Interesting to see the king bring up bread and butter issues like tax cuts and the cost of living, especially given a man of his means. But at the end of the day, this is the government.
He was reading a speech. There's nothing curious about that. They wrote the speech for him and he read it off. He flew over, he read his speech, and then he quite literally went back and jumped on our big gas guzzling jet and flew back home.
Government's legislative agenda. What stood out for you most?
So what stood out to me is similar to what has over the last month, and it is the level of ambition expressed through the throne speech today, but by the government. And by that I mean, normally we hear governments say, we will aim to make Canada an energy superpower. We will aim to improve your cost of living. This is like, we will make Canada an energy superpower. We will transform this economy into the strongest economy in the G7. That is an incredibly tall order. The expectations are incredibly high, and that means the focus from here on out is on results and whether or not they can meet the incredibly high expectations that have been set. That is an immense challenge.
A lot of work still ahead.
That's an important distinction there that Vasi pointed out. Mark Carney has been saying, we will do this. Very definitive. So if he doesn't deliver on those promises, any of them, he's going to look like a fool. He's going to look like a failure. That's why most politicians usually say we aim to cover their butt, to cover their bases. Mark Carney, not a politician. He's a wealthy banker, comes from a different world. He's an elitist, a globalist. He's the kind of guy who gets what he wants. Next up on CBC, we got David Cochran interviewing Mark Carney. Asks him about housing. This is going to get really interesting really quick here.
In terms of what fits in there, but I want to ask specifically about housing. And now I know you said you don't want to force down the price of existing houses. You want to reduce the cost, increase the affordability of new builds, but the GST cut at the front end, driving down development fees to make it more affordable while driving up wages. So buying power, it makes it easier to own a home. So like a simple measure of that is the price to income ratio. And over the last 20 years, that has just gotten impossibly unbearable in a lot of big markets. Like 20 years ago in Toronto, it was 5 to 6 times an average salary. Now it's like 11 to 12. What sort of a ratio are you aiming for with this policy? What's an affordability standard for
it comes back into several things. Now you've asked a very complicated question and you've layered it down, and the bottom line is for Canadians, can I get a mortgage? Can I afford the mortgage payments and I can buy the house? Part of what's shifted is the length of those mortgages and the cost of those mortgages. So there's multiple factors that have to happen here. One is we've got to get take-home pay up for Canadians. The first easiest way to do that is to cut taxes now. We're cutting that middle-class tax cut. That's why that's the first thing we're doing. Cut taxes on first-time home buyers, younger Canadians, they're buying a new home, saving up to $50,000. In fact, in some markets, Toronto would be an example, more than $50,000 off the price of a home. That's all.
So he says, get that take-home pay up, cutting taxes. His savings are $400 per year. That's it. Nobody's buying a house with an extra $400. Give me a break. He knows full well that doesn't move the needle at all. Now, just listen carefully. He's talking about mortgages, first-time home buyers.
Then we need to get supply up in order to get that. At the same time, and we have a very ambitious plan, you'll see that roll out more into the fall setting of Parliament for that to roll out, to get supply up, double the rate of home building, all while growing the economy, because what we need to see is incomes grow. So you combine all of that with mortgage terms, you've got to pull collectively, we've got to get those numbers back, those ratios you quoted, back towards those that you started with.
Well, what's the horizon here? I bought my first house at 28. So if you're a 28-year-old now looking to buy a home, it's tough depending on where you are. Like, how old will you be before it gets to that affordability level?
Look,
Mark Carney's wording this in a way to not scare the older folk that voted for him and having their housing prices drop. Bringing supply up, bringing wages up. If you bring up the supply of the houses, that means there's more of them, thus they're not as valuable, the value drops. So I agree, we need to have more supply, but he doesn't want to say that. There's no way we can increase Canadians' wages to a point where we get that ratio back to 5 or 6 times when it's gone up to 11 or 12 or more. That number will be higher in Vancouver. Think about this logically here. I saw a graph the other day saying the average median income is around $80,000 across most cities. 5 times an $80,000 salary is $400,000. That's what it used to be. So using David Cochran's numbers there, if it was $80,000 for a salary, 11 times, that's $880,000 for a house. Now we know full well if you want a nicer house, you want a nicer area, you're paying $1.1, $1.5, $2 million. But just say a starter house, $880,000. What would the ratio have to be able to buy that at 5 times? $176,000. How are Canadians' paychecks going to go from $80,000 to $176,000? It's just not going to happen. Are people at their tech jobs going to suddenly double in value? Are people at their design firms going to double in value? Will hospitals suddenly be able to pay nurses twice as much? No, that's not going to happen. As a whole, if we make our country more prosperous, we'll have GDP increase. Incomes will slowly go up, but we have to slash the housing prices. The only way is we got to stop bringing in people, build a lot of houses, and let that sit for 5 years.
There is no, here's an insight, there's no monolithic, there's different types of houses, different types of housing markets. It's a segmented market, first point. Second point is, are we building houses more cheaply? The answer is we have to build those houses more cheaply, and there's several ways to do that. Again, cutting GST on housing, that's one way to make the house more cheaper, sorry. The second thing is to cut development charges. So we committed in the platform, we will cut development charges in half. Development charges flow through, that's a fancy word for building the infrastructure for houses. It flows through to the end price. So we're looking at another savings on the order of magnitude of that $30,000, $50,000 off the price of houses if we do it and matched, or as we do it and matched by the provinces. Third way you do it is you change how you build houses. So much more effectively, the productivity in the housing sector in Canada has not grown for a quarter century over the period of time that you quote those figures. We've got to get that down. You can do it at scale. You can do it with prefab, modular. You can do it using Canadian timber, Canadian technology. That's what we want to catalyze.
Right.
Last point, David.
That's what we want to catalyze. He loves that word. He's mentioned the prefab again. It was mentioned in the throne speech. Just wait, Brookfield coming on in. Okay, so it's time to break down this situation. Mark Carney, with his about 400,000 shares in Brookfield, that's worth $11.5 million Canadian today. If he were to say give a contract to Brookfield for Modular Group, as I've mentioned multiple times, this tiny house company in Europe, say they open a division in Canada and start building Canadian homes, get big, juicy, lucrative contracts. Mark Carney stocks in Brookfield will go up in value because this company is going to go up in value. We saw what happened with the heat pump companies after Justin Trudeau made those announcements. Their value skyrocketed. But another important thing to look at, another company that Brookfield owns is this one, Sagan Canada. Now, what is Sagan Canada? Well, it used to be called Genworth. Sagan Canada continues to operate as Canada's largest private sector residential mortgage insurer, providing mortgage default insurance to Canadian residential mortgage lenders. The company plays a key role in making home ownership more accessible to first-time home buyers by offering insurance that protects lenders against mortgage defaults. He just mentioned first-time home buyers, talking about mortgages. Well, who brought in the first-time home buyer program? It was Justin Trudeau in 2019. What happened just a year later? You see it right here, October 26, 2020, Canada's Brookfield business partners to buy the rest of insurer Genworth for $1.2 billion. Justin Trudeau brings in the first-time home buyer program. Brookfield buys Genworth. They rename it to Sagan. This $1.2 billion end up being 1.6, which is what we see here. Sagan, MI Canada Inc. and Brookfield Business Partners announced closing of arrangement transaction. If we look down here somewhere right here, approximately $1.6 billion immediately before closing on the transaction. Brookfield indirectly, yada, yada. So they had 56.6% of the shares, and then they bought the other 42% to get full control of the company. They renamed it to Sagan. And you can see here, they closed this on April 1st, 2021. So Justin Trudeau brings in this program. Brookfield buys up this company, which is the largest private mortgage company. And now we got Mark Carney talking about small modular homes, and Brookfield has that company too. There's a lot of money that's going to be made by Mark Carney and Brookfield. Somehow he never mentions that in any of these interviews, and CBC must have forgot to ask him these questions.
We're going to focus first and foremost on deeply affordable housing. We have a homelessness problem in this country. I think everybody knows it. There's multiple causes. One way to address it is actually to have deeply affordable housing. We're going to focus in on that. That is a role for government. It's a role for the federal government to catalyze and then move out across the spectrum to affordable housing, mainstream affordable housing that's going to drive.
But this is a medium term. This is like 5, 7, 8 years. Is that what we're talking about?
We're more ambitious than that, but you have years, not weeks. Mm-hmm. And you know what? One of the things that's going to characterize this government is being straight with people. Okay? There are things we can do in the short. First off, let's be straight. It's a sunny day. It's beautiful out there.
This guy is such a clown. He's already lied to us 12 times, 13 times. I lost count, maybe even 14 times since he started the Liberal leadership race. He talks about being straight. That's the last thing he does with Canadians. This is a guy who pulled back the tariffs in the middle of the election and didn't tell anyone. Just slipped that under the rug. This is being straight. Was that elbows up?
We are in a crisis.
There it is.
We have to get moving. We have to get moving on these major projects. We have to get moving on building one Canadian economy. That is why the First Ministers, the Premiers, and myself are meeting next Sunday in Saskatoon, because...
That's why they're meeting in Saskatoon. Once July and August roll around, they're going to go on vacation because we're in a crisis.
We have to get moving. That's why a number of the Premiers are here in Ottawa today. That's why some of the Western Premiers have banded together on some big ideas that we're really looking forward to getting behind, and on and on. So we got to move, but the idea that, I'm not saying you suggested, that we can just snap our fingers and all of a sudden housing in this country, a housing crisis will be solved overnight. No, that's not going to happen, but that's not a reason to wait. We're going to get going.
Well, it's the same thing with the major projects, right? And you set me up perfectly for where I wanted to go, was looking ahead to Saskatoon with the meeting with appreciate it. You know, it's time to build. It applies to houses, projects, and the relationships. The premiers all have a list of national projects that have big price tags and require federal approval and federal money. I mean, are we going to see
federal approval? I'm not sure about federal money. Yeah.
I think they might think it involves federal money in some cases, right?
Well, so here's if I'm...
He's like, no, there's no money coming from me. We got to do Brookfield's projects, not what these premiers want.
Do you want to finish your... Sorry.
Well, no, I just wondering, are we going to see specific projects out of Saskatoon? These are the 2 or 3 priorities for this year, next year. What are we going to see in terms of moving this?
What we're signaling in a bold, ambitious plan that's part of the speech from the throne is that we need to move on these nation-building projects. So projects that bring Canada together, projects that diversify our economy, projects that help us export to new markets and really move this economy forward. In effect, we're going to have a competition with projects. Some projects are good ideas, but they're not ready. Others are ready, but they're bad ideas. Some projects can purely be driven by private sector interests if the federal government and provincial governments can make approvals quickly, so investors can have the uncertainty. Other projects may provide such benefits to our country, in terms of diversification as an example, and jobs, that it may make sense for there to be some support in some way by the federal and provincial governments.
I need to ask you about Alberta, and I need to ask you about the oil and gas sector, because I know you said you want to create an energy superpower, clean and conventional energy. A pipeline is a possibility, but not a certainty. And Alberta would say one at minimum is what is needed, maybe three, to the north, to the east, and to the west. This is what the Premier said. Is that a reasonable expectation for the Premier of Alberta? And the frustration over this, and you know as someone who grew up in Edmonton, it's driving a lot of the resentment to the national government of Alberta. So as Prime Minister, how do you confront that?
I think there's a couple of things. One is, let's recognize a few facts in terms of pipelines that have been built to Tidewater and projects opening up, whether it's TMX, whether it's Cedar LNG, and beyond. There's a series of LNG projects. More can be done, more should be done, and from our perspective, more will be done. So we will be moving through this process to make these types of projects possible. Now, we don't begin and end the conversation. It's remarkable in some circles. This conversation starts and ends with pipelines.
But that is right?
No, it's not. No, that is not what has become politically.
This is ridiculous, man. Canada's biggest resource is oil. We could be stinking rich if they leaned into it. That's why pipelines is always the start and the end of the conversation. Alberta's been getting the short stick for a long time. The Liberal government takes money from Alberta and then gives it to everyone else, mainly Quebec. Quebec could be prosperous too, just as much as Alberta if they wanted to, but instead they take Alberta's dirty oil money, then virtue signal, and then refuse to have a pipeline go through their province.
That is not what it's become for Canada. Canada is a nation. Canadians want, yes, they want energy pipelines that make sense. They also want grid connections between our clean grids. They want actually less carbon. So they want carbon capture and storage pathways.
No, Canadians don't want carbon capture and storage. You want that. It'll help you get rich. Once again, back on the board, going up to the carbon capture and storage area, there's a lot of ties here. It all comes back to Stripe. Mark Carney is a board member of Stripe. All the investment in Brookfield. Brookfield has numerous initiatives here attached to carbon capture and storage. One of the main ones here, Entropy Carbon Capture USA, $300 million investment agreement with Brookfield Renewable, $200 million investment through Canada Growth, the CGF Fund, $2.55 billion over 15 years agreement to buy carbon capture, 1 million tons of CO2 per year. This is what the government committed to Brookfield through Trudeau. So it says here, Canada Growth Fund, they've agreed up to 200 million investment in Entropy coupled with the fixed carbon price agreement, up to 1 million tons per annum. So they'll buy 1 million tons of carbon. Mark Carney's got stock options worth around $11.5 million today. This is one of the companies that Brookfield owns. Without going through all of them, I mean, there's Sustanium, Carbon Capture India. We got Origis Energy, this one contributing to carbon offset initiatives. We've got LanzaTech Carbon Capture. Brookfield Renewable has a funding agreement with LanzaTech, committing $500 million to develop carbon capture and transformation projects. Brookfield is a world leader in this. There's no doubt why Mark Carney wants to bring carbon capture and storage into Canada. It makes his stock value go up.
They want broader corridors, for example, Gray's Point in Nunavut, that open up whole swaths of the country to new trade. They want critical minerals so that we are sovereign in the most important components of the future. All of those things are possible. And the more we're doing more of them, the more likely this is going to succeed. That's why these meetings and this process is so important. That's why the legislation that we're putting forward, we will put forward in coming days, is so ambitious. We are in a crisis. We can control our destiny. We are a brave, bold, confident nation. We are the true north, strong and free. But freedom is something you earn every day. And that strength is something we need to reinforce.
But how do you
A whole lot of talk, no action from Mark Carney. He's going to be putting forward legislation soon, very soon. How soon? Next year?
The separatist sentiment that is there in Alberta, there's a possibility of a referendum next year. I mean,
look,
how do you approach it?
This is the greatest country in the world, and this is a country that works. It's a government that's committed to working with.
You can't say this is a country that works when so many people have moved into tents, man. That's insulting to those people. This country worked before Justin Trudeau and the Liberals, your party, came into power. There wasn't tent cities. There was tents nowhere. You could find maybe a couple of tents if you went into certain areas of Vancouver or maybe Toronto, where the biggest amount of poverty and street candy was. Maybe you find a couple of tents here and there, but now there's literally tent cities, little Trudeau towns in every single town and city across this country. Canada is not working right now, period.
I was born just north of the oil sands. I grew up just south of the oil sands. When I was born, the oil sands was a concept. And it was the ingenuity of Canadian, many Albertan engineers and entrepreneurs, and the partnership between the federal government and the provincial government that made the oil sands what they are. This is what we need today. We need all of the actors, private sector, we need research, we need scientists, we need the federal and provincial governments working together. And what's going to happen, and I do feel that this spirit is building, is that we're going to see the projects we're talking about aren't just contained within one province. So it needs multiple provinces, it needs Indigenous partners. And the only way to get it, in my view, is to recognize what a moment that we are in, the need for ambition, the need to work together. And I tell you, David, you saw some of this, I'm sure, in your coverage. I traveled across this great country over the course of the last several months. That's what Canadians want. We're going to go to the wall to get it.
There's a whole lot of talk there and not a lot of action from Mark Carney. He can say what he wants. The evidence of what his actions are going to be are right here on this board. Prove me wrong, Mark. Is he going to roll out a housing plan that doesn't benefit Brookfield? Will Modular Group not be a part of this? Will carbon capture have nothing to do with all of these companies that Brookfield owns? I don't think so.